We are honored to have a special guest today. We have to thank also Beth Levin, the pianist who I had on our podcast, because she introduced me to you, Christine Moore. And you, welcome to Journey of an Aesthete. And you, among many things, you are a classical singer and a vocalist, and you have a brand new recording out. It's always a joyous occasion when an artist has a new novel or a new play. In your case, it's a CD, right? And it's an Odyssey of Spanish song. We're going to talk about your new recording, but also talk about your life as a vocalist in classical music, because that's a special. I don't know if I mentioned this to you before, but I had a long period of time in the early '90s where I wrote a lot of classical music, some chamber music, and I happened to do a lot of vocal stuff. I set W.H. Auden poems.
Oh, love it.
Elizabeth Bishop. And a couple of things like that. So I had experience working with what we would call classical vocalists. And so I wanted to, in the course of this episode, ask you questions about how you approach new music or works by new composers, which I know you've done. And if you have any things you do to prepare for that. But in any event, tell us about how you came to be the singer you are today and release this album and your journey in voice. Whatever
that spans, that's a lot in one sentence.
Yeah.
I started singing. I can't remember when I wasn't singing. My dad was a singer, a non-professional singer, but he sang my whole life. And he, during the Depression, he couldn't take voice lessons because he couldn't afford it. And he'd had a hard childhood, as well as, he was raised by a single mother, was the only boy, he didn't see his father till much later in his life. And so he really kind of had a hard scrabble existence, but he always sang. It was beautiful voice. It was always compared to Bing Crosby. Like, he said, everyone compared my voice to Bing Crosby. And he was an older father. So he was in his 50s when I was born. And so
your question about that was he would have been during the era of the swing era. Was he singing that kind of music?
Yeah, he loved the old standards. So much so that when my sister, who's also a singer, she does blues and West Coast blues, she calls it, and she's an amazing guitarist. I mean, when we were little, we shared a very small room. We grew up in a lower middle class household financially, and my dad would sing to us every night to sleep. My mom would read and my dad would sing. And so my dad would sing these old songs like My Cuties Do at 2 to 2 and Temptation, I Was Alone, I Should Have Known You Were Temptation. And Melancholy Baby was the one that I remember the most. So those three stick out to me. And so my sister and I were singing early on, and she's a little bit older than me, a couple of years older. And then she started taking guitar lessons when she was around 10. And then she started singing with her guitar, and I would sing with her. And my uncle, my mom was from Egypt. She came to the US in the 50s and on a boat, and went to California to be with her sister. My aunt was there already. She had married someone who had brought her to California. So my mom left Egypt and went to California to help my aunt with her kids. She ended up staying there. She met my dad and they got married. So
what years would that have been in the marriage in the
in the 50s? The marriage was in the 50s.
So that's interesting because, of course, there was a lot of Egyptian immigration at that time, actually.
Yeah, when Nasser came to power, it was so much change happening, and my two uncles left. My mom's ancestry is Syria Lebanese. Her family was from the Lebanese part of what was then Greater Syria, but then in 1943, Lebanon became its own country. And so her passport said Syria, but she was from the Lebanese part. So every summer she'd spend the summers in Lebanon because it was too hot in Egypt,
Right.
But my uncle...
You're describing a background where, you're now known as a classical vocalist today. That's your fame, and that's your that's your field, but yet there's so much of the old big band swing, Tin Pan Alley in this thing you're talking about, the music your father liked, and it's interesting, the connection. Talk about that.
Well, the funny thing is that my mother loved Western classical music. Like I found out after she died, she never told us this. She never told me this. I found out from my aunt, you know, the one that she came to be with, that, you know, your mother had a really beautiful voice, and all, you know, my mom went to the Sacré-Cœur, the French school in Cairo, and she got her baccalaureate there. And so Western music was of utmost importance there, even though she was in the Middle East. And that's a little bit, sort of a little interesting story all in itself. You know, I mean, in Egypt, the big singers were the Arabic singers, but then there was this whole part of society that also liked Western music. So my mom would go to the opera house there, and she saw Tito Gobi. She saw operas at the Cairo Opera House. It's the same opera house that Verdi inaugurated 100 years before. Yeah. Or 80 years. Yeah.
It's amazing.
The connection.
Well, I had an experience in the 90s. I got to hear Don Giovanni in Prague. And guess, you know, of course, that's
where the premiere was.
In the opera house.
Isn't that amazing?
That theater was incredible. And anyhow, I didn't mean to, it sort of connects a little bit.
No, I mean, I tend to go off on a tangent anyway, so it's good that we brought it back. So the reason I started that was that my uncle would come and visit when we were kids, and he would record. He moved to Lebanon after that whole 50s period. He worked in Lebanon, and he would come and visit, and he'd bring his recorder and record me and my sister harmonizing. And so my cousin, his oldest daughter, gave me all those tapes like about 10 years ago, and I had them transferred to digital. And it was so cool to hear me and my sister singing back then, you know. And then she got more into, you know, she would sing the standard popular songs at the time. And then she got, we decided to go into blues. She's an amazing guitarist, my sister, and she went into blues, and her then partner was very into it. He's from Texas. And so she that, and I kind of always didn't want to be just like her. I was influenced a lot by her. I looked up to her, but I also wanted to do my own thing, and I liked classical. Well, I had a voice for it. My voice was kind of big already, and I was getting solos in high school. So I just kind of went, well, you know what? Let me do that. And so my poor mom and dad, they thought, oh, they're going to go into fields where that you can get a job, you know. And so we ended up both going into music, where it's just, you know.
It's so interesting. The two sisters, and she went into the popular. Yeah. And you went to classical, but you mentioned something in passing. I'm going to ask you about it because, you know, a lot of folks listen to our show or watch our show that aren't experts on music. You know, of course, they don't know all the technical vocabulary, but you said you had a voice for so talk a little bit about different kinds of voices, or what that are voices for this kind of music, or there's something to that, obviously. Well, I mean,
every voice is different. People are born with, you know, some people have bigger voices, some people have, you know, smaller voices. You know, I mean, I think everybody with a good voice could potentially have a voice for classical prop or whatever, but it would depend. But I think also my sensibility was more towards that. My mom, you know, was a big influence on me. So was my dad. I mean, my dad liked that music too. I think he always said to me, I was told by one voice teacher I went to that I was potentially a tenor, but I couldn't afford voice lessons. So I think my dad might have gone into that too. He had a Bing Crosby pre-crooning type voice, you know, like,
I mean, that music is incredible. I mean, I don't want to, we could talk about, I thought we were talking about opera and chamber music, but if you mentioned Bing Crosby and.
Oh yeah. I mean, I love all that stuff too. I love that era, you know, that era from the, you know, I mean, as John Adams, the composer, said, once, you know, my world would be nothing without blacks and Jews, you know, because of the huge influence of Jewish people and black people on American music. I mean, that is our music, basically.
I mean, one of my favorite books is his Hallelujah Junction. Have you read that, or do you?
No.
That's his memoir. He wrote it. It's really great. I recommend anybody. John Adams' Hallelujah Junction is it's about his life, of course, and Nixon in China and all that. But
right.
There's a lot of stuff in there where he riffs on American popular music. He knows it very well, and he studied at Gershwin's, and he knows that stuff as much as he knows the classical and the.
I mean, that is our classical music. I mean, people think Western classical, European classical, but American classical music is jazz and blues and you know, the combination thereof, you know, musical theater. People don't want to say that necessarily, but I mean, depends on how you define classical. You know, if you define it by Western European classical music, then you know, yes, it's not classical, but that is our music, and there are composers.
I've always defined it a little more descriptively and less. So I kind of define it like sort of where is it done kind of thing. So if it involves a symphony orchestra or a string quartet or an oboe sonata or a French horn, that's classical. But that could be any. It doesn't tell you that much other than those are the instruments that done. You know,
I worked for many years with a composer, Jamaican British, a British-born. Of Jamaican heritage composer Richard Thompson, who's on the faculty at San Diego State, or I think he recently retired. And he wrote a beautiful songs, Western. He was trained classical pianist and decided to bring jazz into his compositions. And he wrote two opera. He wrote an opera based on the famous poet who wrote. Of course, I'm blanking on his name. This is embarrassing. It'll come to me. Anyway, he wrote poems. He wrote a set of songs called "The Shadow of Dawn," which I premiered, and those are very heavily jazz influenced Western classical songs, which I premiered at Merton Hall.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, in the year 2000.
Was that in San Diego or in California, or was it in
no, that was in the songs were premiered in New York.
You've done I can see that you've done so many performances and so many concerts you have to remind yourself of when was that?
Right, exactly.
Because you're so that's a tribute to you because you're a compliment to you because you're so prolific and you've done so much. So you have to he's a great. I'd love to have him on the podcast. I hadn't thought about him in a while, but he's. I mean,
who Richard?
Yeah. You got to work with him. Is just,
He's I think there are two Richard Thompsons. If you're talking about the one that is
the composer,
the composer from San Diego State. He used to live in New York, and so we collaborated when he was in New York. But I've also collaborated with Arab background composers who write Western classical music, but infuse Arabic music into them. I premiered a piece by Mohammed Ferouz called Tawida back in 2007, was it? I believe it was. With Kenyan Azme, the composer and clarinetist, playing with me. I did work by Zaid Jabari, who's a Syrian composer, called Beati Pacifici for voice and piano. I've done, that interests me too. And right now I'm actually working with a composer, Patricio Molina, who's who's originally from Chile, but his mother's Syrian. And he's setting these poems that I found when I was when I was studying Spanish art song in Spain, and I went into this archival building of Spanish song, Andalusian song, and I found these poems written in Arabic by women during the Al-Andalus period. And I said, oh my God, I have to photocopy this,
Sure.
They digitized it. So I literally photocopied all these poems. And people all think that women weren't active back then, but they were writing poetry too. And somehow
there's a major movement.
So he has now written about 9 songs out of those poems, and we've been working on them, and we're set to record them next year.
Congratulations. Getting back to you and your sister now. I'm always fascinated in people's stories and how they learn to do what they end up doing, but also how it's different for every artist. And so talk about the transition from that young person
Okay.
to how you developed as a voice, and anything that you want to say about it, because it's a remarkable thing that happens, right? So,
Well, when I was in high school, I was mostly like up until I was 15, I think, or 16. I was mostly doing, stuff with my sister. We would harmonize
okay.
on songs, and we would, this is before she ventured out. She moved away when I was 16
Okay.
and joined the Air Force Reserve. And so she's a veteran. She was in the reserves only. And then she started to do.
The Air Force is renowned for their musicians. I'm sure you know about
Well, she met many people there that also were, guitarists, and she collaborated with them and singers. Then when she left, when she was discharged, she never had to go into combat, which I'm grateful for. And then she moved back to Sacramento, where I'm from. I'm from California, Sacramento.
Yay.
She moved back. And then we would, but before that, we would just do stuff together. And then when she left, I started singing in high school, and I was always getting the solos. So that was an indication to me that, okay, I guess I have a good voice, and then in high school choirs back then, a lot of the music was classical. Right now they do a lot more of a mix of popular and classical, but back then it was mostly classical. And we had the madrigal group, and I just kind of liked it. My mom always had Evening at Symphony on when I was a kid, with the San Francisco Symphony or the Boston Symphony, Seiji Ozawa. So I would listen, I would watch it with her. And so she influenced me heavily on my interest in classical music. And she never told me that she also had a voice. She kept that a secret. I don't know why. I think her father, who was a little bit of a discouraging person, didn't really encourage her. And so I think it was painful for her maybe and she didn't want to talk about it. But, and she wasn't, to be honest, she wasn't always encouraging of me. So I was kind of on my own a lot in terms of my career. I was self-driven, and I think that she probably didn't want me to do it secretly, but at the same time, maybe, felt a bit of remorse that she didn't get to do it. But my dad was encouraging, but I was kind of on my own. I didn't really have any mentors, except, my high school teacher was a mentor.
Sure.
In a way. And then, but nobody really, and I took voice lessons starting from age 16, and my teacher there encouraged me. Jackie Victorino was my teacher. And I just did a lot in the Sacramento and Davis. I went to UC Davis for a few years. And I was always getting the solos there, which I'm embarrassed about, but it wasn't a vocal school per se. So there weren't that many people. So I got an opportunity. And I got solos there, and I just started loving it. And I decided, but I was kind of lost. Like, nobody had said to me until one day, one person who was collaborating, my voice teacher, who was a professor at University of Pacific, said, you really need to get a voice performance degree. But at that point, I was already like 20, like most people start when they're 18. But I started kind of late with that. So everything was kind of late with that. And then he said, apply to UOPs, which I did, and I got in. But then another professor, who was also a wonderful mentor in a way, he said, don't go to UOP. He said, why don't you apply to go to New York? And I'm thinking, New York, like that seems like might as well have been, I don't know, Malaysia or Timbuktu or somewhere incredibly far away,
It's funny.
And then I thought, okay. And then I told my mom I was going to apply, and I thought she was gonna be against it. But then she kind of liked the idea, and it's because she grew up in Cairo when it was extremely cosmopolitan. So my mom grew up in a big city. She was a big city person. She was pretty ahead of her time for a single woman. She had a job, and she kind of gave all that up to go to California. And so I think she had a little bit of regret. I don't think she was so happy when I was growing up. I sensed that. And she, but she was so she kind of, I think, in a way liked it, which shocked me. I think because she thought, oh, I can go visit her. So I applied to 2 schools, and I got into one of them. I got into Manhattan School of Music.
Wow.
Juilliard's very competitive, but I got into Manhattan School of Music, and I thought, well, okay, there goes my life is changing now, and so I decided not to go to UOP. I decided to move to New York. And
yeah, ask what year you were at Manhattan School of Music in New York.
And I had met actually a new music champion of the time in the 80s and 90s, Bethany Beardsley. She had a residency at UC Davis, and she was my final. She made the decision easy for me. She said, "You really need to go to New York." Yeah. So if a soprano who lived in New York is telling me I need to go to New York, I said, yeah. So I did, and I moved to New York, and I finally went to music school, and some of my credits transferred over, and some didn't. So I was on like a three-year bachelor's instead of just 2, and I really enjoyed my experience there.
So I was at New England Conservatory NEC in 86, 87, 88. When were you at Manhattan School of Music? Was it the
the mid 80s? Yeah, I'm older. Yeah.
Well, I'm not counting. I'm just we're almost peers in a sense. So there's kind of
maybe we saw each other. Who knows? You know. And you weren't the same. So you weren't at the same auditions as I was.
I just think a lot about those years, and it's a different, right? It's different when you think about it now, right? Because Ben, you were at Manhattan School, and every school has their own system. And when you were at Manhattan School, what was their distinction as a school at that time? You know, what was
it was a more of a voice-oriented program at the time. Maybe people who go into Juilliard might disagree, but the dean of the school at the time, Joseph Pelosi, was very vocal-oriented, and the president of the school was John Crosby, who founded Santa Fe Opera, and so they were very is it John Brownlee? I think is it Brownlee? The school was basically in the building that Juilliard used to be in. And when Juilliard moved to Lincoln Center, Manhattan School of Music moved into that building. But it was founded in 1924 or 1921, and it had its 100th anniversary a few years ago. Yeah. But it was always, I think, to maybe distinguish itself a little bit from Juilliard, which was an instrumental school. It always had more of a vocal focus, you know, and a lot of the singers that ended up going on to big careers went to Manhattan School. Obviously, the great ones like Leontine Price, she went to Juilliard. But so there was definitely a focus on vocal music there. And, you know, we had put on 2 operas a year, and we all got opportunities to be in the operas.
2 operas a year?
Yeah, they would put on 2 operas a year, and there was contemporary music.
They're not messing around. I mean, that's you know.
They still do. Now they have more operas because now it's a totally different school now. It's really developed even more so. The current president, James Grandry, who was my classmate for 1 semester there, he left and went to Roosevelt and then came back, and he's been their president for over 10 years now. And it's still a very vocal school. They have musical theater now. And they have, they started their jazz program before anybody else did. It's really,
they're actually famous for their jazz program.
Yeah, it's really, really grown so much. I'm proud to be an alumna of Manhattan School of Music. When I was there, it didn't have as many programs, but I had great teachers. I had Thomas Grubb, you know, I had some, you know, a vocal coach. I had some great teachers there. I learned a lot. Martin Katz taught for a semester there, and I really loved working with him. Gaït Sergei was our French coach. So it was really, really great. Great experience. And I worked the whole time I was there because I kind of had to, and it was a time when I could, you know, make some money and also support myself. And I found a very cheap apartment up in Washington Heights. Nobody at the time lived in Washington Heights. I lived in Washington Heights, and I had a very cheap, beautiful studio apartment. So I could actually afford to live in New York. Now a lot of musicians live up there. Yeah.
Well, that's a very 80s story. The whole thing, Washington Heights, and I can feel. Also stuff going on in music because at that time.
Yes.
You know, I don't know if you've done William Bolcom and Jan. William Bolcom.
I haven't done any Bolcom songs, but I love his songs. Yeah.
And then with Jan Morris, right? It's a whole.
Yes.
They're a whole. thing onto themselves, you know.
Yeah, exactly.
Onto themselves. But that was they were starting up at that time, I think, right? And that was
yeah.
And I remember too in the 80s, it's sort of like I was kind of stuck in the middle of it was, you know, still at the 80s that it was the avant-garde 12-tone thing was still going very strong. Now there was currents against that,
Yes.
like silver glass, but the currents against that weren't as big as you might think. It was still very much the non-tonal. Was that big where you were there? Kind of the
well, you're gonna laugh, but my very first opera that I was ever in, and that was at UC Davis. I was 19.
Wojciech.
It was an opera called Callisto and Melibea by Jerome Rosen, who was on the faculty at Manhattan School of Music Composition. Not Manhattan, sorry, UC Davis. UC Davis was, you know, where I attended before I moved to New York. And UC Davis was a big composer's school, still is. Not so much a performer's school, but now it's more that, you know, they've expanded a lot. But when I was there, it was composers. And they needed someone to play the part of the maid, you know, and they saw I was a good musician. I didn't have perfect pitch, but they said it was a 12-tone opera.
Yeah.
So my very first opera role was a 12-tone opera.
What do you make?
It was really hard. I had to memorize.
Oh, it's so hard.
Well,
that's really amazing. So you're an opera singer, and your first opera is not it's not Verdi. It's not Marriage of Figaro. It's not.
My first opera as a soloist. I was in Sacramento Opera. Had just formed.
It's not even Wojciech. Like if you had done, had you done Wojciech, that would have been more accessible, actually.
Exactly.
You were thrust into the deep end of the ocean.
I really was. I mean, it was pure 12-tone, and it was. I was in the opera chorus for Sacramento Opera, and we did La Bohème and Carmen.
Yeah, more traditional.
But in terms of you know, my first role, it was a small role. And then we did like several performances. There was one performance, I learned this lesson. This is a funny story. I'm sitting in the, you know, the green room, and I was chit-chatting with the lead. She and I were both off at the same time, you know, and and then all of a sudden the music stops on the monitor, and I'm going, why did the music stop? And I realized that I missed my entrance.
Oh.
And you know what it's like to miss an entrance with a 12-tone opera?
I mean, that's
so I ran on stage, and they're all looking at me like, you know, where have you been? Where have you been? All, you know, the stage manager. And then literally they had to stop the opera. So they were all frozen in time on stage, waiting for me to make my entrance. And somehow I remembered everything, and I came on, I did my line, and then the opera continued. It's almost like they put the recording on pause, you know, like, you know? So that was kind of.
You learned.
I learned my lesson: never miss your entrance.
Well, not just that, but also about different styles of music, right? It's kind of interesting, and I'm sure the book is very different than another kind of book would be. You know, in a libretto rather.
Yes,
would be different. You know, so that's your, and then after the 12-tone opera, what happened then? What was the?
After that. They put on Der Freischütz, and I was sick, so I couldn't be in the chorus for that. They wanted me in the chorus. But then they put on Candide, a joint production. At Davis, they would just put the theater and the music department they put together. So, but I didn't really do any more opera. I did a couple of opera scenes, and most of the stuff I was.
When you say Candide, you mean the Bernstein, Leonard?
The Bernstein, yeah. I was in the chorus for that, yeah.
That's a good score.
Yeah, oh man, I love that so much. Your garden grow, you know. Yeah, that's so beautiful.
What was your impressions of the movie? Just curious. We're on the.
Maestro.
Yeah.
You know, I loved it because how many people make a movie about a composer and a conductor? Nobody. I mean, there was the other one. What was the one with Kate Blanchett that a lot of people didn't like?
Tar.
Yeah.
Tar.
I mean, I liked it also because at least it was something about. I mean, it ended up it totally took me by surprise what the movie ended up being about, you know, because they don't lean into that until later on. But still, it was kind of, you know, interesting to see that at least somebody's doing something, you know, about the classical music world. But I loved Maestro because, you know, I love Bernstein. I actually got a glimpse of him when I was at Tanglewood. I spent a summer as a Tanglewood. The program was Phyllis Curtin, and he was there that year. And I remember he drove up in his convertible that had the license plate Maestro 1. And it's funny because in the movie, they were very careful to show that was his license plate, Maestro 1. And, you know, everybody was excited and I took a couple of shots of him, but also just, you know, he was such a talented person. And so I love the fact that Bradley Cooper decided to take that on. And so, yes, maybe more could have been put in there, but he decided to focus on this one aspect of it with the help of the Bernstein kids. And
well,
so really, I'm more forgiving of it than maybe people who, you know.
Well, when you
it would have been a 3-hour movie if they had included everything else,
or even 4 hours. You know, who knows?
Exactly.
I don't know. Yeah. I mean,
the activism. You know, his wife, she was a big time activist. You know, she helped Black Panther Party. I mean, there was so much they could have brought in, like him involved in it as well. Yeah. But there's just too much to put into that. But I thought his acting was, you know, wonderful. I mean, I would love to see a sequel, maybe. Who knows?
I don't know. Yeah, but it's movies about musicians, Whiplash.
Yes.
I don't want to get too down the rabbit hole because there's just so few, right?
Yes.
Nobody ever makes movies about musicians, really.
No.
You know, like there's many movies about sports stars and figures and football.
Right.
So is there, if you had to pick during that time, it could be the 80s, it could be the early 90s, I don't know, when you, in a production of any kind or in a chamber music where you really come alive and you felt that this is the most important thing you've done to that point, what would that have been, you think, at that, in those years, or what was the part, or whatever? What do you think?
Well, I was in the period between the late 80s and up until the mid 90s was the most active period in terms of opera. There's a story behind that. But I was an apprentice at Central City Opera, and then I was an apprentice at Santa Fe Opera in 1990, and I covered one of the roles in Ariadne auf Naxos, and I also did a scenes program, and I got very good reviews from the local, you know, so that was encouraging. And then I went and did a program in England at the Edinburgh Festival. It's not the Edinburgh Festival. It's the Britton Piers School, and they put on an opera there. Mm-hmm. They did Falstaff. And so it was not a professional production, but it was a really great experience because, you know, we put it on in Italian, and I got to work with Renato Capecchi, who was a great baritone at one time, and then he ended up becoming a stage director. Then from there, I decided to invite some agents to come to the performance, and one of them came and invited me to come and do an audition for Dutch radio, I think, Netherlands radio or something. And so I went and did that audition literally the morning after my final performance. And so I was kind of like a little groggy, you know, took the train into London. And then I was still in London at the time, like a couple of days later, that same agent called me and he said, listen, Leipzig Opera is looking for Mimi. Are you still in the UK? And I said, yes. Oh, yeah. So I called my mom. I said, Mommy, can you buy me this ticket to fly me? You know, my dad had since passed away, and so I could fly to Leipzig. And Leipzig at the time, it was 1991.
Oh, yeah.
Reunification had just happened in
1990.
And I had done a whole audition tour in Germany the year before, and I was in Germany when the wall fell. So I was glued to the TV the whole time I was trying to do auditions. I didn't get anything from those auditions, but I was kind of there in Germany at an amazing time, you know. So then a year later, I'm sorry, it was not 1991, it was 1990. That's when I did that program. And so I did the audition in November of 1990, which was a month after reunification.
That's the year.
And I went to do
amazing years.
It was an amazing time.
I don't really think that, you know, people that are really young, well, people that were born in 97,
yeah,
or born in 98, of whom there are so many.
Yes.
I don't
people
know if
in that age, they're starting out their careers now. Yes. Yeah.
Right, but it's
in singing anyway. For singers, it's you know, mid-20s.
That's a singing. But I'm just thinking those years. I mean, I personally was doing a lot of stuff in those years. I mean, my flute sonata premiered at Wigmore Hall in '91, and I did.
Great.
What else? Just but that was also I was writing. I wanted to mention this because I wrote for a lot of vocalists. I would say probably 3 or 4 in those years, and very different, a baritone, 2 sopranos. And I had never done that. I'd never written for classical vocalists before, you know? And it was a very, we'll talk about that because when you're doing new music, well, I mean, of course you did a 12-tone opera, but is there, I mean, there was one soprano I wrote for. She and I had a little bit of a conflict because I wanted certain things from her that she did not want to do. She was very strict, and her thing was, I wanted to minimize vibrato. I wanted her to sing close to a kind of a straight tone.
Okay.
But she was against it. Now I guess there's a school that's against that because of her training. And then she said to me, that's unhealthy for me. And I'm thinking, I guess that's you know, is that a training issue?
Well, okay, it depends.
Yeah, it does.
If the songs that you wrote called for more of a straight tone, like they were more pop or jazz, and so you wanted a little bit of that style, then yes. But if they were like Western classical compositions,
sure,
that you know, art songs. You know what I mean? In like Samuel Barber,
right?
You know, like that old school. It depends on why you would want her to not have vibrato. Was it that you just don't like vibrato in general, or I'm just saying this hypothetically. I'm not asking.
Because the piece had popular influence on it, and it was not. You know, that was that reason. So
right. Okay. Well, then I totally get it. You know, but some people just
she never did that, and she was. So I had to give up that fight and concede to her training, and that was one experience with the soprano.
Well, if they had a popular influence, if they were like more like you know, American standard style songs, then I would understand it. I don't like to hear full vibrato in those songs either. You know, maybe a little vibrato at the end, like you hear, you know,
sure,
most of the jazz standards.
You mean terminal? Is that called terminal vibrato? Right. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. It sounds terrible. Terminal vibrato.
Die
from your vibrato.
I mean, that's just the term, but she was a great singer, but working with her was an interesting experience for me because I don't think I work with all kinds of people, mostly instrumentalists. I don't think I ever had anything like that with any of the instrumentalists I ever worked with. And
well, vibrato.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh no, and I often thought that maybe it's just something about the world. There's a world of voice seems to me its own world and its own, and voice. Yeah, it's kind of
well, just what maybe some instrumentalists don't necessarily know is that a healthy voice in a healthy classical voice is the vibrato is constant. That's the sign of a healthy voice, and a healthy voice production for classical music. Okay, if you have a strong technique, a vocal technique, and I know this just from my own experience. There are ways to straight tone your voice that are healthy. You know exactly what to do, how, and I teach that even to my own students. You know,
oh, you teach.
Yeah, I also teach. Yeah, and also when I sometimes have jumped in for church jobs, I can't sing with a full vibrato if I'm doing macho, you know, if I'm doing, you know, anything Renaissance-y or even Baroque, you know, Baroque.
That's a word for it.
Yeah, Baroque. You know.
You're in a Baroque
but Baroque, you know, you know, I'll pull off the sound a little bit when I'm harmonizing. If I'm doing a Baroque aria, however, like, you know, Handel or Bach or something, I will allow my vibrato, but, you know, to be free. And then you can train yourself to use the straightening of a vibrato to add artistry and color. But the natural, healthy production is with vibrato. And so instrumentalists, like string players, for example, now piano, you can't do that, obviously, unless whatever. But string players train themselves how to add the vibrato, but they can take it away. Like Baroque violin has a different bow, which makes a lesser vibrato tone, you know, fading out, fading in, you know, the Baroque bow, you know. And so in terms of your singer, that's probably, maybe she, you know, it depends on the circumstance. Let's put it that way. You know, in my opinion,
or was it? It was just one experience with one singer,
right?
And it was
I mean, some people have bigger vibratos that maybe, you know, I don't know about that singer, but maybe it's just not appropriate. Some people have naturally lighter vibratos. Every voice is different, you know.
Sure.
In that case, like if I were doing a standard piece, like your American standard, you know, jazz standard, or something that's kind of in between, you know, I wouldn't necessarily use my full vibrato.
Right. Well, you know, there are singers like yourself who are just so skilled, or they're not just professional. Of course, you are professional, but in addition to that, you're the kind of professional that knows about when to do what's required and changes that. There's a flexibility, right? With probably flexibility in terms of literature, when the piece was written, and
if I could add, based on what you just said, add on to that, in my CD, it's called From Andalus to the Americas, an Odyssey of Spanish Song. And like I said, I start in the earlier period, and I purposely took away my vibrato for like everything up until there's one composer, Graziano Tarragò, who wrote a flamenco-ish song, but it's more operatic, and so I let my vibrato there. But the early songs, I definitely controlled it more. I have a whole set of Sephardic songs on there for voice, guitar, and flute, set by Manuel Valls. And those I definitely pull off my vibrato. And it was hard. It was really hard because requires a lot of breath support. But I did not want a full operatic sound there. And
well, being able to make those decisions and also make them, you know, in the context of a recording, you know, that's going to be documented.
Yes, exactly.
Really, I think sometimes people aren't aware of what a feat that is, and so I'm kind of saying this is something that should be mentioned. That, you know, it's a skill, and
the Arabic song I'm doing, which is not a Western song, it's with oud, which is the Arabic lute, which is where the word oud comes from. For lute, it comes from al-oud, which means it's the early instrument that started I think in Persia, or maybe it made its way from China to Persia, and then to the Arab world, and then to Spain. Sure. And so that song, I don't use any vibrato, maybe a little bit, because it's not appropriate, you know?
Right.
So, but it does require a technical skill to be able to take that away.
It's amazing. So, you know, Germany, and then in the 90s, and
well, I wanted to finish my story just briefly because you asked. No.
Yeah.
It's fun to go off on tangents and these things.
We do that. That's
yeah. But just as I had to get up, you know, at the crack of dawn after a performance to go in to do that audition in London, I had to get up at the crack of dawn the day after this agent called me to get myself to take a flight to Berlin. And back then, the train stations were all still separated because unification had only happened a month before. So I ended up I was trying to get to Leipzig, which is, you know, Bach's hometown, you know, basically. And I was so excited to go there. I was trying to get there, and I ended up going to the wrong train station. So I had to spend the night in Berlin and then get up at the crack of dawn to go to my audition, and barely had any time to warm up. And I did this audition. I got offered the role right away. And it was a premiere, and I was going to be in the second cast. I wasn't doing the premiere. I was going to be in the second cast. I'm thinking, that's fine. So I would say then the next year, I ended up getting to work with Peter Konvichny, a very famous stage director, East German stage director who was based in Eastern Germany, and then it was already starting to work in West Germany. Yeah. And then it was one Germany he was working, and I got that great experience, and I got to sing several performances over the course of a few years of Me. And I would say that was probably operatically the highlight, of my career. I got to sing with the Gewandhaus Leipzig Orchestra, which was the famous orchestra that had been made famous because a lot of the Kurt Masur was the conductor at the time, and he led those protests on the Alexanderplatz which at the time was Karl Marx Platz, against, for opening the wall. So it was very historic moment, and that's where the Leipzig Opera House is located. So it was really exciting for me, both historically and artistically, for me to be able to sing that. So I would say that was the highlight operatically. After that, some hardships came into my life. My mother had a heart attack. And so I ended up leaving my time in Germany. I was starting to do more auditions there to get more work. And then I ended up having to leave that whole life and come back to the US. And I was going back and forth to California. She survived. But it was just like, I couldn't bring myself to just go back knowing how far away she would have been. So then, I ended up, and that's when I also met my husband, and my life shifted away from performing for a couple of years, just to do the caretaking my mom. And then back then there was no internet, so I kind of lost contact with my contacts that I had in Germany, and I maybe lost a little bit of confidence. You go, can I do that again? You start the self-doubt. I've been away for a few years, and I kept singing. I did some recitals. I kept singing, but that whole opera world sort of over there, I dropped out of it for a while. But then I was in New York, and I started, doing some teaching. I've been teaching for a long time too, and that's when I met Beth, and Beth and I started to collaborate, and then I was very happy. She was resurrecting her career and doing wonderful performances, and started to make some great recordings. And then I started getting interested in, I did the American Composers Alliance. I did a couple of seasons with them. I did some contemporary pieces at their annual concert. Then I started getting interested in Spanish song, partly because of my heritage. Sure. I thought, the closest thing to, Eastern music, Eastern classical music, Arabic music, was really like Spanish Western classical music. And I love the language. I grew up in California. I didn't speak it at the time. I do speak it now, but I didn't speak it at the time. But you hear the language, and I always thought someday I'm going to speak it. I spoke French at home with my mom. Wow. Up until I was 5.
How many languages do you speak or no?
I speak 5. I would say four pretty fluently. In Spanish, I would say Spanish, I'm somewhat fluent. Maybe it's getting better. I'm working on it. I definitely have a knack for languages. I studied Arabic. Arabic's really hard because you have to. It's a totally different alphabet, obviously, and I can read it, but and I can pronounce it well. I know how the diction, I learned that diction in order to sing my songs. But I don't know if you know, there are 22 Arabic speaking countries, and some regions have their own dialect, like the Levant, Lebanon, Syria, Palestine, Jordan speak one dialect. Egypt has its own dialect. Morocco has its own dialect. Tunisia has its own dialect. I mean, that is somewhat similar. And then you go further east, And the further you get to the Gulf countries, the closer it is to classical Arabic. Classical Arabic is what is in the Quran. But then they have what's called modern standard Arabic, which is like a simplified version of classical Arabic. That's what people learn in schools. But the problem when you go and study that, you can learn a lot of basic modern standard, but then you can't necessarily apply it when you travel to countries, because it's like speaking Shakespeare. It's like, you know, how do I love thee? Instead of saying, how much do I love you? You know, but so I haven't really to learn. It's important to be really immersed in it and then learn that dialect. And so I studied both Egyptian dialect and also studied Levantine dialect. So my Arabic is shaky. I have taxi ride Arabic and simple conversation Arabic, but and I studied Russian a little bit just so I'd understand the grammar, because I love Russian art songs. So I wanted to at least understand the grammar so that when I'm singing in Russian, I'm not just singing syllables. Like I know what the verb is. I know, you know what I mean? I mean, every song I learn, like any classical singer, we're trained, we memorize the words and we know what every word means. But my brain needs to know.
Memorizing. Do you memorize the words separately and first before musical?
I like to study the text first, and I go over the text, and then
you deal with the melody.
Yes, and then I translate it. Now I can kind of do both, you know, because I speak the languages. When I'm singing a new art song in a different language, you know, if it's the language I speak, unless there's always words I don't. There are always words I don't know, but you know, if I'm learning a new French song, generally speaking, I'll know what the whole thing is, like, you know. But still, I like to delve into the poem and really, you know, study the poem separately. And I tell my students to do that too. It's the best way. Because then when you're an artist, you're really to have a lot more colors that you can bring into it, you know? English as our native language, it comes naturally, obviously. You know that you're going to say, I'm trying to think of I'll think of a Broadway song, for example. Some enchanted evening. You know that the word enchanted is describing the evening. So you're going to stress that a little bit more.
When you meet a stranger.
Yeah. When you meet a stranger across a crowded room. So when you're singing art songs.
Rodgers and Hammerstone.
I love Rodgers and Hammerstone. But when you're singing an art song in a foreign language, you need to know what the verbs are. And you need to know what the adjectives are. You know, elle est très belle. She is very beautiful. You know, or elle est très jolie. So in the art song, you would bring out the word très, maybe, you know, or you know, in German, you'd see, like, for example, An die Musik, the famous Schubert song, An die, du holde Kunst, you beautiful art form. You know, in wie viel grauen Stunden, in how many gray hours. You know, when you're singing, that you add that color to it, and the audience is going to be affected by it. You know, they're going to, you know. So I think it's really important for singers, if they can, to learn the language, even if it's just the basic rudimentary grammar, and they're doing that now. They didn't do it when I was in School of Music. Now singers, I'm really happy, they have to study 1 year, at least one semester, 1 year of the language, and not just the diction. When I went to Manhattan School of Music, we only had diction, but now all the music schools for the vocal performance majors, they study the language, and that's great. I think it's really important. I encourage people to, if you can, go and live if you can afford it, go and do an immersion for 3 months if you can, or take a semester abroad, you know.
Christine, am I to understand that your new exciting release was done some years ago? Was it even pre-pandemic, or do you want?
Yes, yeah. Let me talk about
years. Came through that, or how we came through that.
When I was studying, you know, Spanish art song in Granada, and then also in Madrid, there was a program that actually a former classmate of mine founded, Nama Babakhanian. She was a classmate of mine in School of Music, and she started this program called Festival Canción Española, and it was based in Granada. It was a program. And they also did one at Mannes College. So that was in 2007. I decided, you know what, I love this music. I want to do this. So I did both the program in Mannes and also the one in Granada. And Teresa Berganza was head of the program. She was, you know, there, and there were all these wonderful vocal coaches, one of whom I've worked with, and he's the one who is the pianist on my CD.
Okay.
And he was my coach first, and then we worked together in several iterations of that program. It then moved to Madrid, and so then over the course of those years, I thought to myself, you know what? I'm not getting any younger. I really want to make this recording, and also I had this idea in my head always of putting together, linking somehow the Arab world, and in some way, you know, even if it's a non-academic way, linking that world into Spanish song. And so I found these old songs. One is for voice in vihuela, which is an early Spanish guitar. And of course, the songs that Lorca arranged. Federico Garcia Lorca was not only
Blood Wedding,
most incredible poet and writer. He also was a composer, or he was a pianist. And he went with Manuel de Falla. They went around Spain and they gathered all these folk songs.
Huh.
And Lorca gathered the folk songs and he arranged them for voice and piano. And then they were also transcribed for voice and guitar. And they're very popular songs. You know, your average person on the street, you know, 150 years ago knew these songs, but then they were sort of codified into sheet music, and a lot of classical singers have recorded them. Berganza de Los Angeles, Caballé, I think, also recorded them. I'm not sure. But all the great Spanish singers, Pilar Lorengar, they recorded them, and then they became, you know, the Siete Canciones Españolas of Manuel de Falla became very popular, and they're popular in the West. But there's so much more of a treasure trove of Spanish art song that people in the West don't know, that I was able to learn, you know, that aren't all on my CD, but that you know, Guridi, who's a composer from Basque Country, he wrote great songs. My favorite, who's not originally Castilian Spanish speaker, but Catalan speaker, Toldrà, he's from Barcelona. He wrote 6 songs.
I had a brief experience. So I'm in a movie. This isn't entirely unrelated. So Jose Luis Guerin, the filmmaker, is a friend of mine. He did In the City of Sylvia, and I'm in his documentary. When I used to live in Boston, and he's very Catalan, and he's always saying, Mitch, you always trying to get me to come to Barcelona and party with him, I guess. I don't know. I haven't been able to do it yet. But
there are some gorgeous songs written in the Catalan language. Toldrà wrote most of his songs in Catalan, and Monpó, I probably didn't pronounce that right, Monpó, also wrote songs in Catalan. And they also wrote a few songs in Castilian Spanish, you know, what we regard as Spanish, Castellano, they say in Spain. In fact, in Spain, they don't say hablas español, they say hablas castellano. You know, do you speak Castilian? They don't use the word español. We say it out here in the Latin American world, but there it's Castellano. So, and there's some gorgeous songs by Toldrà. I love him. There's just so much variety. Guridi, I don't know if he wrote songs in Basque, but he was from the Basque region, and he wrote some gorgeous songs in Castilian Spanish. So I was introduced to all of this, and Jorge Robaina, who's my pianist, he was also my coach there, one of my coaches there. We recorded this over the course of in 2011 and then 2014, and it was kind of spread out for a lot of reasons, because there were some health issues going on also in my family, not with me, but in my family. And so I kind of spread it out a little bit. And then starting around 2015, 2016, around that time, I started to get this weird allergy that was really affecting my voice. I went to every ENT and they couldn't figure out what it was. So I kind of stopped performing, you know, I was teaching more heavily during that period. So I kind of started performing for several years, I'm still studying new works, new music, and I did some performing. I did performing that didn't show off as much of my voice where that was affecting. But then I thought to myself, how can I release this CD without being able to have a release concert and perform and do concerts? By the way, I do have a concert at the end of June, so I hope people will come. And June 28th, a CD release concert at Christ and St. Stephen's Church near Lincoln Center.
Oh, yeah.
June 28th.
That's a great room acoustically.
Yeah, it is. It's a perfect room for what we need. With that, the thrust altar area, it's like a perfect room.
It's amazing.
But anyway, so I just, and then the pandemic happened. Funnily enough, a week before the pandemic started, March 14th or whenever it was, I had this really terrible bronchitis. It was just so bad that every night I was coughing. I couldn't sleep all night and coughing. And this is like a week before. And then it finally went away, the bronchitis. I don't think it was COVID. It was just generally a bronchitis, I'm pretty sure. I didn't have any breathing problems or anything. So then pandemic hard. And then like about, 3 weeks in the pandemic, I'm like tooling around on the piano and I'm working with my students online. Right. Everything's online. And I'm going, And I'm like going, wow, I can sing that note. So I started doing these scales and everything had cleared up.
That's beautiful. That's really beautiful.
And it was like, and then, everything cleared up, but it's the pandemic now.
Yeah.
What do I do?
So it cleared up during the pandemic, and you're saying, well, what do I do?
Yeah, well, I can't really do any concerts, at least in person. So that was when I decided, Christine, it's really time to just release the CD. And, and every singer, every performer has doubts about their recordings, and they go, oh, I could have done that better. It's a natural reticence. But then I thought, you know what? Life is short. There was so much tragedy happening around me with the pandemic. New York lost so many people, and it was just so sad. And I lost two. But one thing I forgot to mention is in 2005, I studied Arabic singing.
Wow.
I went to an Arabic music retreat, and I decided I wanted to study Arabic singing. So I learned lots of songs from that repertoire where you have to come off your vibrato. And so two of the most wonderful Arab musicians were lost during the pandemic. One of them was my teacher, Bassam Saba. He died in 2020 that year. And so it was just a sad time, and also classical musicians. And it was just such a sad time. And I thought, life is short, really need to get this out. And so that's what I did. I just, worked with my producer. I said, can I still release this? And he said, yes, of course. So that's kind of how that all came into fruition,
And that's where we are now, and that's your recording, and you have when in June, so New Yorkers could come.
The concert is June 28th.
June 28th, you have to go see Christine Moore.
Yes, and also my guitarist, my wonderful guitarist from Spain, is also coming, Pablo Jimenez. He plays flamenco and classical. He was trained classical, and he's going to do a solo or two. So it's not, just going to be everything that's on my CD. You're going to hear solos from both of them. And my wonderful flutist, Laura Falzon, a lot of people know her. She's from Malta. She's going to do the Sephardic songs with me and Pablo. And then my Arab musicians, I have a wonderful darbuka player, percussion, who's going to play with me on the Arabic song, and a wonderful oud player. So it's going to be an interesting concert, and I really hope people can come.
Well, it's going to be a good concert, and that's why I mentioned it twice, because I want people to go to it.
Yeah, thank you.
Because it's important.
Yes.
I really enjoyed this discussion a lot. I learned an enormous amount. I'm very impressed with your ability to talk about some complex things. Again, as I've said before, not everybody's a musician. Certainly not everybody's a professional musician. And so it's great that you're able to articulate in ways we can understand some of these details.
Well, thank you. I always think that I don't know enough, but
well, if you know 5 languages, you're okay. You're doing all right.
I love language. I've always loved languages.
But I just wanted to thank you, and I want to make sure everybody gets the Odyssey of Spanish Song.
Yes, from Andalus to the Americas. An Odyssey of Spanish Song. Oh, the same day as the concert.
Okay.
It will be released on all streaming platforms.
All streaming platforms?
Yes, the same day on June 28th. Yes.
June 28th is a magical
Yes,
day.
Friday, June 28th, 4 weeks from yesterday.
And so I thank you, Christine.
Thank you so much, Mitch. Such a pleasure.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.